I have a little bit of a confession to make. I'm a millennial. This is the most common name given to my generation, Generation Y, which follows Generation X, and is roughly defined as those born between the early 1980s and the late 1990s into 2000. The majority of millennials now find ourselves in early adulthood, facing the same challenges every generation does in this time. Over 50% of my generation does not continue to be associated with a local church after leaving high school. There's been a long trend toward a decline in church attendance in this age range, but historically adults seem to find their way back after having kids. With adolescents and millennials lingering on through our late 20s into our early 30s, children are coming later in life, and we are spending more time away from the church. IUCC is currently in a time of discerning how to continue to grow. We are just completing a stewardship campaign that will allow us to grow in the coming year. We are making plans for a future building campaign. This millennial generation of young adults is one of, and possibly the most important targeted group, and indeed the future of the church. We have the opportunity to reach this group, which is struggling to find a church and welcome them into our midst. To do that, it will be helpful to understand what sets millennials apart. We millennials are the first generation born into the digital age. We do not know a time when the personal computer was not made available. We learned to type on a computer, not a keyboard, typewriter. I would doubt if most of us know how to use a typewriter or have any idea what correction tape is. I only know that because my grandma told me about it. We are described as digital natives. The first thing we do when we wake up in the morning is check our cell phones to see what's been going on in the world since we were asleep. Millennials are the biggest and possibly the most individualistic generation. The Barna Group, which has been doing research on millennials for over a decade, calls us the mosaics because we pride ourselves in our individual uniqueness. We are engaged in sharing our unique experiences on social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. This individuality may be the biggest contributing factor as to why so many millennials consider themselves Christians without actually going to church. We can do spirituality on our own. The Barna Group released a short video that tries to answer the question, why are millennials leaving the church? In true millennial fashion, I'd like to share it with you.
You might have noticed that here in America, there's one group that's not nearly as involved or engaged in the church as other age groups, 18 to 29-year-olds. We call this generation the mosaics, and for most churches, this is a demographic black hole. Just how big of a black hole? Get this, 59% of mosaics with a Christian background drop out of church after attending regularly as a teenager. Now, on the surface, this doesn't seem like a new problem, and in some respects, it isn't. People in this age group have left the church in droves for decades, but historically, many come back. If you think that's going to happen with today's generation, think again. Today's young adults are very different from their counterparts of the past. A lot of them are rethinking the major things in life. Stuff like whether or not marriage is still necessary, or if the church really matters. What's strange is, the majority of these dropouts actually still consider themselves Christians. They're big fans of Jesus, just not the church. Every mosaic has their own unique reason for leaving the church, but ultimately, they all point their fingers at the Christian community, and what they're saying is, you lost me. Now, hold on. You lost me? Isn't that a little harsh? Well, maybe, but what a person really means when they say that to someone is, you're not making sense to me. Research from our team at Barna shows that millions of mosaics don't feel like they can ask their most pressing life questions in church. So it's no wonder they turn to technology, pop culture, and their peers for answers. With all of the resources on the internet, young people have access to answers to lots of things, important and trivial. And some of the answers seem to make sense. But just because something makes sense, it doesn't mean it's the truth. Naturally, all that conflicting information leads to more questions and more confusion. These wandering souls are viewing the world through a distorted lens. They need the wisdom of the church to help them see things through the lens of faith, but they can't even see that. What we need is real dialogue and real answers to the questions that all too often just get swept under the rug. It means we stop ignoring the elephant in the room, roll up our sleeves, and seriously address the tough questions about science, sexuality, culture, and lifestyle. Let's be careful not to judge them too quickly, and give our young Christians the tools they need to cope with the modern world. We need to teach them to be discerning in today's culture, to be influential among their peers as followers of Christ. Today's changing world is a tough place to live faithfully as a Christian at any age. But if we're gonna change the world together, we can't afford to let another young person say, "You lost me."
Millennials are not hearing from the church that which resonates most deeply within them, so they leave. They want their faith to be able to hold up to the questions they have, questions that many churches are afraid to address. Now, IUCC is perfectly poised as a place where we aren't afraid of questions. What we must do is provide the safety of a Christian framework for millennials to deal with these questions. Unfortunately, there is quite a bit working against the church as a whole. In the book Unchristian, David Kenneman, president of the Barna Group, compiles their research on millennials and the church. The target was a group aged between 16 and 29 as of 2007. They were asked to discuss their impressions of the church. The data was processed and themes emerged that described millennials' attitudes toward Christians. The list goes something like this. They described Christians and the church as hypocritical, focused on conversion, anti-homosexual, sheltered, too political, and judgmental. Kenneman goes on to describe the alternatives to these perceptions. For the church to reach millennials and combat these notions, Christians should be transparent about their lives, acting first and talking second. Christians should cultivate relationships and environments where others can be deeply transformed by God. Christians should show compassion and love to all people regardless of their lifestyle. Christians should be engaged, informed, and offer sophisticated responses to the issues people face. Christians should be characterized by respecting people, thinking biblically, and finding solutions to complex issues. And Christians should show grace by finding the good in others and seeking their potential to be Christ followers. Take a moment to ask yourself which of these areas are our strengths. In which areas is there room for us to grow? I chose today's text from the lectionary because it offers us a chance to look at something a little different. The gospel text today is Jesus' parable of the talents. It would be easy to build a nice sermon around this, yet I decided to take the road less traveled. Today's passage is from Paul's letter to the Gentile church newly established at Thessalonica. Now, this letter is most likely the oldest text we find in the New Testament. I'll give you a little context of what's going on here. Timothy has just returned to give Paul an update on what's going on with this new church. As with most of Paul's letters, they're addressed at specific issues challenging these churches. The church in Thessalonica was faced with a culture of idolatry. Even if our Christian culture doesn't expect Jesus to return in the future, this issue is still relevant in modern times. We're not so different from them. The passage begins with a deep apocalyptic imagery about thieves, seasons, and darkness. To understand how these early readers may have understood these words, it's helpful to understand a little more about them. They believed that Jesus would return very soon, within most of their lifetimes. In the previous chapter, we see that they've become concerned about their loved ones that have already passed away before Jesus comes back. Paul eases that anxiety and continues sorting through their concerns. He describes the return of Jesus as coming like a thief in the night. It will be unexpected, breaking a false sense of security. Destruction will come as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, something from which many of you know there's no escape. Here, Paul is describing what Jesus' return will be like for those who are in the secular culture, who are not in this church. This dominant culture was not one centered on Jesus. It was human-centric, full of debauchery, pleasures, and worship of many gods and idols. Amy Peeler, who's a professor at Wheaton College studying the New Testament, describes this context that the Thessalonians found themselves in. Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, was worshipped in Thessalonica, and his nighttime celebrations had the reputation of being frenzied, ecstatic, and sex-filled events. Having called the Thessalonians from the worship of dead idols to serve the living God in previous chapters, Paul says that they should no longer participate in such events. Indeed, they are to be people of the day, who wear the armor of faith, love, and hope. Essentially, they're called to be countercultural. When Paul speaks about eschatology, how everything will happen at the end of time, he does so in order to bring comfort to his congregations. He reminds them that their own unique Christ-centered worldview is different than their culture and is what they believe the source of life. This is the worldview in which millennial Christians were raised, and I must include myself here. We come out of high school with what Fuller Seminary professor Kara Powell calls an understanding of the gospel that is little more than a list of do's and do-nots, a list of behaviors. In my experience, it's impossible to keep up with that list. She says, it seems like we millennials have really picked up a behavioralist view of the gospel. This contradicts our desire for a relationship with a relevant Jesus. We want to believe in a Jesus who speaks to us personally in a way that is real and helps us face our contemporary problems. We want a faith that challenges and changes who we are and how we view the world, thus giving us an opportunity to live that faith out in a way that changes the world. The works we do are deeply rooted in our faith and our scripture understanding. Now, I know not everyone here shares the same worldview. That is part of the beauty, is how we walk alongside each other, no matter where you are in life's journey. The question I ask you is, how do we make room for these millennials that may come with a worldview that is different than our own? Are you comfortable accepting millennials who have a more orthodox theology but are more socially progressive? Millennials question everything. Another name for Generation Y is the Y generation. It seems appropriate. It reflects our tendency to be wary of institutions, including the church, political parties, and even other people in general. What this means is that millennials are actually comfortable with re-examining nearly every aspect of our lives, including our faith. In fact, as journalist Tyler Frank writes, you could argue that millennials' comfort with re-examining long-held traditions and sometimes jettisoning them without hesitation is one of their most Christ-like qualities. After all, Jesus torpedoed the convictions of his religious contemporaries by the boatload, once illustrating that point by saying you can't pour new wine into old wineskins. Millennials bring with us our own unique culture, one that we want to integrate into our church, one like this one, that shares the love of God with compassion. But many millennials don't know that churches like this exist. That's why I wanted to share this with you. Many millennials have misconceptions that the church is uniform and homogeneous. We here at IUCC have to find ways to make what we do accessible to those who aren't here yet. It means learning about millennial culture. You can offer us millennials what is missing from our Christian faith, the good works that should come from that. But everyone here must ask ourselves, does this congregation focus so much on those works that we forget to talk about faith? Because millennials want to talk about faith. This is absolutely a safe space to believe different things. My faith may be different from your faith. But when generational cultures collide, we can't expect to change one another. Instead, we must learn from one another And then, like the early church, we can together create a culture that is different from the world in which we live, so that we can find deeper meaning and the richness of life that comes from following Jesus. Will you welcome and accept millennials? Us. Knowing that the experience we bring with us, though it may have a different culture, seeks the same end goal. We all want to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God.